Okay, so this is for all the Cholim of Klal Yisrael. They should have a speedy refuah shlema.
Amen.
Okay, so continuing with business ethics, reward of one who conducts business with integrity. As great and comprehensive as the demands of dealing with integrity are, so too are the rewards for a person who fulfills them. First, the spiritual rewards are immense, since only a person who conducts his business with integrity merits to ascend the mountain of Hashem and to stand in his holy place and sit in the inner sanctum with him, as was discussed in the earlier chapter. Aside from the spiritual reward, his benefit from in this world is immense. In Mishnah, it is written, "A man of integrity will increase blessings, but one impatient to be rich will not be exonerated." The Metzudat David explains, a man of integrity is a person who does business with integrity, doesn't deceive other people, is destined to an abundance of blessings. But one who hurries to enrich himself will not stop cheating and will not be exonerated from his just retribution. And let me just finish with what Rabbeinu Bachaya says in Kabb HaKemach. Rabbeinu Bachaya says, a person who has lips of truth, in inverted commas, in parentheses, and is mindful that his speech should only be aligned with truth will always obtain success with such speech, and it will last forever. People will always trust his words because people will perceive him as a man of truth, since he has been accustomed all his days to speak the truth.
Powerful, Kevin. That's very powerful, really.
I'm a big advocate of that.
I nearly gave this book away to Gavin Bra. I nearly told him to take it to Australia with it.
Okay, well, I'm pleased you got it. Honestly, I'm enjoying it very much.
Yes, and it's the halachic aspects to it as well.
No, I like it. It's a mixture between Musa, Halacha. It's the whole point of why we.
It's common and it's practical. It's very important for all of us.
The whole reason we're learning Bava Kamma. What you're doing is you encapsulating the spirit of it, the principle of it. Really. So thank you.
Just give me 1 second. I want to put this in the cupboard. 1 second.
All right. I've got a joke for you guys.
Okay.
I said to you, it's interesting. I think it was Rabba that used to, before he gave a shir, one of the Tanoim, I think it was Rabba, used to tell a joke to his students before he started to get them like just like
in the mood.
In the mood, you know. So even in those times when you're dealing with the Tanoim, you wow, I mean, can you imagine? So the Jewish joke goes as follows: the two Jewish women at the hairdresser, each one of them is under a dryer. The one woman says to the other, "So, Nu, how's your family?" So she says, well, the second one responds, she said, "Fine. My daughter is married to the most wonderful man. She never has to cook. He always takes her out. She never has to clean. He's got a housekeeper. She never has to work. He's got such a good job. She never has to worry about children. She never has to worry about the money. He got her a nanny." So she continues with a question to the first lady, and she says, "So how's your son these days?" So the first woman says, "Just awful. He's married to such a witch of a woman. She makes him take her out every night for dinner. She never cooks a dish. She made him get a housekeeper. God forbid she should vacuum a carpet. She's never done a day's work in her life. He has to work like a dog so that he can just maintain a standard of living, and she won't move one iota of a finger. And she never takes care of the children because she made him get a nanny."
Yeah.
That's two different perspectives on the same thing. So that's interesting.
On exactly the same thing. No, it's excellent that.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of that joke where this mother has her son in a school play. She said, "So what part are you playing?" He says, "I'm playing that role of the Jewish husband." She says, "Go tell your teacher I want you to get a speaking part."
Yes.
So where we are in the Gemara is we were saying, look, basically, we were talking about if an assailant blinded his victim's eye, the assailant must give him the value of his eye. And regarding the loss of employment, we view the victim as though the assailant made him grind at the millstone. So what he's saying is that at the end of the day, if you make somebody blind, they can only do a very limited amount of work where they're not having to use their sight faculties. And not only does the assailant have to pay him the new value of his job apart from actual damages, but he has to make sure he pays him to have a company person that can take him to his job and back at grinding at the millstone. And the one that we battled with is if an assailant made his victim deaf, he must give the victim the value of his total value. And what that meant is that he's seen as a dead person. So a deaf person isn't fit for any work, according to Rashi, and he's regarded as a dead man. So since he's lost all his worth as a slave, he's paid his total pre-injury value on the slave market for his physical damage and nothing for loss of employment. So nothing for loss of employment you can understand because he can't do anything, but it's obviously equivalent of millions of rands worth of settlement as though you were paying for a dead person. And the question that I was battling with Arthur when he was speaking about what Rabbi Cohen said is, how could it be that a deaf person is seen as dead and a blind person isn't? How can being deaf be worse? Because we said that the Gemara says, like, if a deaf person can't follow instructions at a job, I mean, if he can see, surely you can write him down and then he can find his way around doing jobs that require sight. Maybe it was a different time. I don't know. It's still difficult to wrap my head around that. So the Gemara is going to ask a question on this current situation. And Rava actually inquired, if the assailant cut off the victim's hand and the judges did not assess him, and afterwards, before the hand healed, the assailant broke the victim's leg, and still they did not assess him. And then before either of these injuries healed, the assailant blinded the victim's eye, and still they did not assess him. And ultimately, the assailant made him deaf. What is the law? So what it's basically saying is that in the interim stages of the various assault charges that the court didn't assess, so we're not sure if those assault cases came in relatively quick spurts of each other. I mean, it just sounds like an absolutely horrific situation, to be honest. So the Gemara is saying, look, do we say that until now, they have not assessed the victim at all? And if that's the case, one assessment suffices for him. And the assailant gives him the payment of his entire value altogether. Or perhaps we assess the injuries one by one and award him the payment for each. So what we're actually saying is that because deafness is considered like death, do we ignore all the previous sort of payments? Because when you're assessing and paying somebody their full value, it has encapsulated the entire bodily value. So does that suffice, or do you have to give for each and every injury? So Rava explains his question. So the halachic difference between the two methods of assessment is whether the assailant needs to give the victim payment for the pain and humiliation of each and every injury. Okay, so granted that we don't award the victim payment for the damage, healing, and loss of employment of each and every injury for one obvious reason. Because once the assailant gives him the payment of his entire value, he's like one who killed the victim and he's given him the payment of his entire value. So in other words, with regard to the payment for damage, it doesn't make any difference whether the method of assessment is used either way, because either piecemeal or in one large multi-million-dollar payment, because the victim will receive his full value due to him becoming deaf and therefore regarded as dead. So there's no difference regarding the loss of employment, because since the damage payment is for the victim's full value and the victim can't work again, it's as if the victim became the assailant's servant, meaning that the assailant has to put his very life's value into the damaged party's hand. So obviously there's no loss for employment, because if you consider to having killed somebody or the effective earning potential, there's no temporary loss of employment. You're paying them in the nezek, the actual damage, their full value of their life. So in that case, he required all the victim's income in full with his full damage payment. It's just a nice way of saying, listen, he's still paid for everything. Regarding healing, it's a bit of a more complicated case because the victim wasn't healed between each injury. So the assailant technically doesn't have to pay the cost of healing between each injury, because although although the commentaries say that Rashi's explanation seems difficult, what actually happens in practicality is that the assailant has to pay the victim for the entire healing process. So whether he did it at each separate juncture or at the end when he became deaf for all his wounds up until that point, there is still full payment for medical damages after the final injury. So it's actually going to not take away any obligation that he has for healing. The only difference is that if each injury is assessed separately, the assailant might pay a greater amount than if it's assessed at one period of time. How do we use this as an analogy? I guess you can think of it similarly to if you go to one doctor's consult compared to multiple visits. Generally, you can go to a doctor. I generally go to a doctor and I say, listen, I've got 5 things wrong with me, and I try and get my values worth. I try and get my values worth. But other people don't do that. The minute they become a hypochondriac and they've got something wrong, they pay each and every time they go to the doctor. But they're on Discovery Classic Comprehensive, and I'm on a hospital plan. So, Gavin, I don't know what you think. So what they're basically saying here is that either way, the assailant has to pay the victim for medical bills. But when the victim comes in one juncture by the court, it's probably going to be less in terms of medical bills. But the victim's worth is the same, and the medical cost is the same except for the consult. Makes sense. It's pretty straightforward. So Rava just wanted to know, do you pay for each and every stage? In other words, is it possible that he must give restitution for at least the pain and humiliation aspect of each and every stage? We're not talking about the actual medical damage, because he had pain and humiliation each and every time. So since the victim certainly suffered humiliation and pain from every injury, it's possible that he should receive payment for those categories, even though he was later made deaf. So in other words, you say, okay, so just because halachically you almost killed the guy by making him deaf, does that mean he didn't suffer by being humiliated psychologically and the physical pain on each and every juncture? So you're kind of rewarding somebody for making the person deaf. In other words, if they have to pay pain and humiliation and they figure they're just going to give him one clap and render him useless, and that's the final assessment as though he was dead, what happens to the pain and humiliation charge? What do you guys think?
Say that again, please. You say he became deaf?
No, I'm saying, Kevin, what the Gemara is talking about is this assailant. He first clapped him and broke his arm. Then he broke his leg. Then he made him blind, and then he made him deaf. So what happens is, at the end of the day, the assailant is kind of being rewarded, because when he finally almost halachically killed him, because being deaf is equivalent financially to being dead, we're saying, okay, so he makes a payment for the actual nezek, for the actual damage, might be a couple of million rand. But what he hasn't paid for, if you look at it as an end-sum game, is for the pain and humiliation of each and every incident. So what happens as far as that's concerned? And Rava even extends the inquiry, because if it's, Rava says, and if after considering my question, you conclude and say that since the judges did not assess the victim after each injury, the assailant indeed gives him payment of the entire value altogether, what is the law if they assessed him after each injury, but the assailant never gave any payment? In other words, the court ordered it, but the person didn't give it until the court actually intervened and forced it. Do you say that since they assessed him after each injury, the assailant is required to give him restitution one by one? In other words, separate payments. And we're talking now not of the medical bills, because either way he has to get him fully healed, and he has to pay him once off for what his entire value is worth, because it's no good paying him for a loss of employment because he's permanently disabilitated now. Or perhaps since he has not yet paid, the assailant gives him, the victim, the payment of his entire value altogether. So what do you guys say? Do you say that each assessment creates a separate liability which remains in place despite subsequent events? Or perhaps, guys, you say that since the obligations haven't been satisfied until now, the assailant becomes liable for the victim's full value, as if the former killed the latter, bit by bit, you know. So the assailant pays the victim's full value in one payment, as if he'd killed him, and then each pain and humiliation becomes nullified. What do you guys think?
So,
Where's
Kevin, go for it.
I'm
We
just
lost
trying to
Arthur.
think. Gavin, you start first, but then I'm just thinking I can respond.
No, we got to wait for Arthur.
Should I phone him then?
That would
Yeah,
be
please.
that would be super. See, this is why it's very difficult to give a share when people are doing other things.
Well, I do that all the time. I'm busy watching Netflix. I've got DSTV on. I've got
Only film shows Gavin watches. He's very film.
Yeah, no, you must
Push
see.
to stop recording, Dan.
You see what I'm able to do in this 40 minutes. It's absolutely remarkable.
Well, listen,
I'm doing research at the same time.
It's amazing. Some of the guys only focus on sleeping, so at least you're multitasking. You're the head of the group, man.
I'm absolutely multitasking. Chicks dig me. They dig me purely because I can multitask. They're like amazed.
I can't hear.
He's joining.
There's no connection in the build.
Oh, shit.
Right, now
maybe give it a few seconds. There we go.
Right, now I'm going to edit that part out of the share. Can't hear you, mate. Speaking away, I can't hear a word.
Okay, my 4G doesn't work in this area because it's a really bad area.
Okay.
So my telephone terrible, but I'm on Wi-Fi at the moment, so now I got you again.
All right, so Arthur, where did we end off? Where did you finish sharing me?
Now he's on mute.
I can't hear. You know, it's fun. Everything's a joke. I'm just, I don't know.
No, sorry, I didn't realize you were on mute again. I've got a habit of just tapping mute. God, I heard what you were saying when I got into the lift.
Well, can you tell me what point I left you? Look, I think at least
abbreviate me again.
So at least I think my small consolation is at least I'm helping you listen to Rabbi Cohen. That's at least something, I guess. Okay. Do you remember anything of this year, mate? I'm not criticizing. I'm just asking anything at all.
Just give me a quick word, and I'll probably come back to me in a second. Just give me a hint like the other time, it'll come back. And I know that. I remember you. Oh, you were talking about the Maccabi and all that stuff. That part I remember. And you covered the hospital plan and the fairness of that. That part I remember. I didn't use the share, but that's part of the part I remember. And you're also talking about what I spoke about earlier about when the guy loses his arm and then he loses his leg and then he loses and he couldn't work out why. If he goes deaf, why does he not qualify for anything?
Yeah, that's true. I said that in the beginning. And then, guys, I just asked you a simple question. If there were multiple injuries and it resulted in deafness, where the person's considered financially dead, basically for all intents and purposes that they can't earn a living, is there pain and humiliation paid for each and every injury? Because the medical is paid. Either way, we have to get the victim right. The assailant has a lachic obligation. And either way, if the assailant can't earn a living anymore, there might not be a loss of employment fee until he recuperates, because he will never recuperate. And therefore, the actual damage, the nezek, results in millions of dollars, or whatever that person's life worth is in terms of their earning potential. That's paid. But what about the pain and humiliation? What do you guys say? Is it paid for each and every one, or is it waived by the fact that this person is now seen as financially dead and the person's made restitution for that? What do you guys think?
Well, I think you should pay every step. I think all the damages should be paid in its entirety. It's different to that other concept of yours, of the Torah, where if you've got multiple things, what's it called, death? You've got a death penalty against you, and you've also got what's it called, penalties against you. That the death penalty takes priority and the others fall away. But yeah, I don't think that's the case. If I happen to do a whole lot of injuries towards you, humiliation, all these other types of things, and then eventually you become deaf from all of us, I think that you absolutely deserve every single thing. And I'm also curious as to why it doesn't seem to take into account his future earnings in this whole thing, or does it?
No, it does, because that's an excellent question, because it means you were paying attention. What happens is there's two payments. There's the actual assessment as an employee. They call it the slave market. Let's call it employees. I think it's a better analogy. So we say, look, what would his position be as an dentist that was hired in a dentistry firm, for example? And in terms of if he had permanent disability, okay, in that particular case, then his payment would be worth his entire lifetime of that earning accumulated at once. That's the actual nezek damage. What happens
And
is
would it be would it be based would it be based on the slave market? Sorry, I didn't just clarify that part. What's his value based on?
So their value is based on not as him in his own business. And we discussed last time there's a problem, because if a merchant gets damaged, even his temporary loss of income is a problem, because we can't say what a merchant would have earned in terms of buying and selling products or goods or services in his business. There's no way to ascertain that. So he's actually penalized. So when they call it the slave market, we call it indentured servitude. So in other words, I would prefer to think of it as an employee market. In other words, the rate is fixed for what that career is worth as an employee, not in your own business, because the whole point of this is that the assailant he has to pay, but it has to be within means that are practical. If you're going to take for him and his whole family any future earning that this assailant would earn, because this guy happens to be wealthy, then I think it is fair, Gavin, but they seem to say that there's a more lenient opinion, because I'm just going to answer it in this way, and then I'll address all you guys. Is the Gemara says, do you pay on each and every payment, or once this person is seen as financially dead, you pay the final value altogether? And the Gemara says, let the question stand unanswered, because, Gavin, in all monetary cases where the law is in doubt, the halacha follows the lenient approach. Okay, when there's monetary cases when the law is in doubt. So if it follows the lenient approach, the assailant makes only one payment for the victim's full value. However, if the victim seizes the assailant's assets, an amount equal to the payments for pain and humiliation for each injury, the court doesn't take it from him. So I think the moral of the story, when we've learned in all damage cases, is the first thing that you've got to do is take property and assets from the assailant, because the court can't extract it from you at that point if you owe the value. It's actually very bizarre and difficult to understand how they made those assessments.
It also seems like you've got carte blanche to kind of take the law into your own hands. I mean, this hasn't even gone to court yet. We don't even know if the assailant is in fact an assailant. You know, all this type of stuff. So to go in there and just at your own discretion and say, listen, all right, this guy's attacked me. I reckon this is worth a bar, and go into his fields and just steal a bar's worth of equipment, like his tractors and his combine harvesters. You can't just do that.
So when I asked about this, look, from what I understood, it was that the court will adjudicate the matter, and if they found that the property was confiscated without due cause, in other words, the onus is on the injured party to prove what damage was caused. So, Gavin, you remember this rule that if somebody damages you, we don't find him guilty unless he's got evidence. So he has to give those assets back. The onus is on the person proving his case to prove that he's owed the money. If he can't prove it, he loses those assets that he's attached. The sheriff of the court will take it from him. So he won't get to keep it.
No, he won't get to keep it, but you can't just go willy-nilly and start attaching guys' assets when this thing hasn't gone to court. It hasn't even played out yet.
No, listen, I get that, but I also get the practical nature of to try and extract money if somebody owes you money is a very tough process. There have been people that
I understand that.
Owed me money, and I've never gotten the money because I haven't got anything of theirs to attach. So how am I going to extract the money? It's not going to be possible. So the only way I could technically do it is to take their car with the papers, go to court and say, listen, this is my case. I'm not giving it back unless I get restitution and sell the car and take back my values for what I was damaged. Otherwise, how do you practically enforce it? How do you, this is a very, very difficult case because the court should have the power to basically force somebody to work. The thing I don't understand about this case is they said, in the one part of Robert's statement in the beginning, it was saying, like, what happens if the court found him guilty and he just never paid? How does that transpire? How can the court not have the power to enforce it? I understand the second question, that there was an assault on a number of occasions before it came to court. But how does it get to the stage where the court paskins on it and the person can get out of payment and the court can't enforce it? I battle to understand all these concepts. The only thing that I understand is if there are halachic monetary issues, it goes on the lenient opinion. But I think that the pain and humiliation of being continually assaulted and living in fear and terror should be paid at every juncture. I can't agree with you more, Gavin.
That's what I think. Yeah.
I really don't understand. You can actually traumatize somebody for life.
It doesn't sound like it. It doesn't really sound like an eye for like an equivalent to an eye for an eye. It just doesn't.
So what they're basically saying is there are two balances of payment, and those balances of payment is as follows: is that tell Danny I said half. The two balances of payment are as follows: is Gavin, you either pay the capital disability worth millions up front, and your recovery payment is low. Because what happens if we're saying, look, the guy can't become a dentist again, so now he's lost about 10 years worth of workable revenue, and that's 3 million rand. Okay, the assailant has to pay the victim 3 million rand. But when it comes to terms of recuperation, since the guy is physically disabled on a permanent basis, what we're saying is that it's a very different case now, because we only pay him what he's worth now as a crippled individual of what he can earn at his current potential. And you're saying, well, he wasn't treated fairly. He was, because the initial nezek was paid for his actual loss of income from his previous state to his current state. So it's either paid as a capital disability all in advance, in which your share at your recovery is now paid in your compromised position of what you can earn while you recover until you've got your new job, of what you can achieve in your capacity of impairment. Or we say if the injury is temporary, which we're going to get to as Arthur learned, is that your capital disability is low because it's not a permanent injury, but your recuperation, your shevet, and your recovery and loss of earnings is very high, because the guy was an accountant and he was earning 120 grand a month, and you have to pay him for 6 months of recovery, but he will recover. So your capital disability is low, but your loss of employment is high. So that is balanced. It absolutely is balanced. Am I making sense? The only issue is this multiple injuries until the person becomes deaf. Because what it's doing is, if you don't get paid for pain and humiliation, it almost makes sense to assault the guy in the final straw. Because if you see all of his disabilities up until that point, you're almost paying the capital disability of much of it anyway. But now you're not paying for pain and humiliation, and you're paying for medical bills in one juncture. So I'm battling to understand it, to be honest, in terms of logic. But it's not a flaw in the Gemara. Maybe it's because we're coming from a 21st century context, and I don't know how it's applied. And one of the things I'd like to speak to Rabbi Cohen is, when he addresses us, is I'd like to make an issue of everything we've gone through in this chapter with you guys, in this last chapter, which has been the longest up until now, and of the 7th chapter, and with the 8th, because the 8th chapter is quite short, and say, listen, these are all the issues we have so far. Can you address some of the questions that we have? And I think if you guys give about 20 minutes just to go through all the issues, and we all come to Rabbi Cohen together, it might add a lot of satisfaction. And since you put in hundreds of hours, you might as well get some satisfaction, because it ain't going to be from my limited knowledge. I'm just suggesting, guys. I'm not telling you what to do. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, great.
But it's difficult to know how to apply it today. So, listen, what we're going to discuss, I mean, we've got about 8 minutes left, which I don't actually want to discuss it at this point, even though it's a short share, then at 8 minutes less, is we're going to be discussing cases of temporary injury. And temporary injury, yeah,
I mean, in today's times, you don't have the implant, hearing aid, in terms of the deafness or whatever it is. So
sorry, mate.
technology today would make
Speaking of
some
deafness,
cases of
I can't hear you too well. What you mean?
I can't hear him at all.
Repeat. I need you to repeat what you said, Arthur.
okay.
Okay, so basically, what I'm trying to say is, in today's times, you can have an ocular implant for your deafness. A lot of the time, there are different techniques you can do to restore your hearing. So, how would that apply today? That's a question.
So that how that would apply to us as follows is that the medical costs of ocular implants and a myriad of technological advancements, in other words, top range hearing aids, operations, etc. That sort of medical bills and shevet, as well as pain and humiliation, is paid, but your nezek, your actual payment for temporary damage, for permanent disability, is reduced, and your recovery and your medical bills would proportionately go up higher. That's what we're going to be learning in temporary damage. In other words, you either have a very high capital disability and your recovery rate as a cucumber watchman, in other words, is your new incapacitated position, pays minimum wage. It's not unfair, Gavin, because you get millions of rand in capital disability. So Arthur's brought up a good point. With today's technology, a lot of these illnesses are recoverable, at which case the assailant has to pay for each and every cost of. That doesn't go away. The reality is, thank God, today there is a remedy. One of the points that we're going to learn in terms of temporary injury is, what do you do in terms of the slave and the master? Now, the reason why, I don't know, I've got an aversion to this thing of slavery. I really, really battle. But the bottom line of it is, it's about a Hebrew slave is an indentured slave, meaning he owes a debt. So his service to his master is to pay back the debt. So what we're saying is, in temporary injury, we're going to discuss a case where the employer or master, so to speak, that has lost money as a result of this thief that might have stolen from him and doesn't have the means to pay it back. He's lost out on the service of this employee because this employee is redundant now. So who gets paid? Does the employee get paid or the employer? Because both have suffered damage at the hands of the assailant, even if it's temporary in nature or permanent. So these are some of the issues we're going to go through. But Arthur's right. Thank God we're living in the 21st century where people can recover from many of these illnesses. And we
What you were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
So in this day and age, you have cochlear implants, and people's hearing can be restored, and other body parts. There's technology and there's prosthetics that could be used to restore their mobility or the prior movement that they had before the injury by the assailant. So the assailant will be liable for that.
every bit, every cent, guys.
And maybe if they have this cochlear implant or a prosthetic limb, maybe their humiliation, it may be less, it may be more, because they got maybe there's humiliation after that, because they got prosthetic leg. It's not the same as a normal limb anymore, and
There's absolute fees for humiliation.
So humiliation could come after that, even though
Absolutely.
Maybe there's a case for that too.
Absolutely there is. And in fact, the capital disability might not be there, but it might cost a fortune of money to pay for these medical solutions. But Gavin, all we said was when there was permanent disability, the loss of employment fee would be less because you would pay for the person's future earning potential for the rest of their life, and the capital disability, the actual net. So that's why the loss of employment is only in the newfound position of limitation. And Kevin's 100% right. It's absolutely humiliating to be permanently disfigured.